Thank you for joining us today. I think and tomorrow. We have a really nice assortment of different talks and workshops, so we're happy you could be here to participate in that. So I'd like to start today by introducing the president of SUNY ESF, Joni Mahoney. So Joni, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you. Good morning. Keep eating, please. I haven't even had time to put my name tag on, but as Steve said, I'm Joni Mahoney, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president here at SUNY ESF. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge where we stand, that we have the privilege of meeting today in the ancestral lands of the Onondaga Nation, the center of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who we honor for their many contributions, including the original philosophy and practice of environmental stewardship. Welcome to ESF, and pardon our mess. We got going with some construction projects, taking advantage of a little quieter time in the summer, but we're so happy to have you all here. And it's particularly gratifying for me because I was able to participate in the original conversations about creating this center, and you two have just done an extraordinary job with it. And I was thanking Kelly Chesum because I was brand new when we were meeting with the president of Clarkson, right, Tony, my friend, and Kelly walked us through the process of making all of this happen, and then to walk in here today and just see so many talented people coming together to share ideas and learn. It's really gratifying. So I want to just tell you, if you'll give me like just 1 minute on a personal note. I was reading in the notes about the Survey of Climate and Adirondack Lake Ecosystem Scale, and that it's a project to monitor and sample over 250 Adirondack lakes, and it will update the extensive round of sampling from the 1980s. I happen to have an uncle, his name is Jim Mahoney, Dr. James Mahoney, and you can look him up. Unfortunately, he died too young, but he was the director of the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program. I see you nodding. Did you really know that already?
I knew his name, that's all, yeah.
Okay, yeah, Jim Mahoney, and I remember him being interviewed. It was very controversial at the time, and I remember him being interviewed on 60 Minutes about it, and I think the ultimate result was some amendments to the Clean Air Act. So I have in my DNA, I have this incredible fondness for the study of the lakes and the ecosystems in the Adirondacks, and to see that this is happening again and being updated. I can't wait to talk to his wife and his kids. There's still a lecture that happens in Washington, D.C. every year in his name, and I guarantee at some point the work that's being done here will be something that's talked about there. So I appreciate you listening. I was very fond of him and haven't been able to talk to him in a long time, or even about him in a long time. So this session looks fascinating. You're starting out with a fantastic keynote speaker, Charlie Driscoll, and I see that you have 30 speakers over 8 sessions, and I'm just envious that you're going to be able to spend all this time listening to expertise and sharing your expertise with each other, and we're just happy that you're doing it here at ESF. Thank you to Clarkson for being wonderful partners. And I would really like a round of applause for Dr. Stephen Shaw, who has done an incredible job on the ESF end of making this a reality. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Stefan Grimberg, who will do the honor of introducing his president.
Thank you. My name is Stefan Grimberg. I'm the co-director from the Clarkson side for the center, and it's my pleasure to introduce our president, Professor Larson, to the podium to say welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Larson, the president of Clarkson, not Tony, so new president since we got this center started. We're so thrilled to see how much it's growing. I was here last year during my first year of the presidency. I was able to attend the afternoon poster session and the dinner last year, and I'll be back this afternoon to be here for that again. So it's wonderful to see the growth in this event, this annual meeting of the center. It's really great to see the breadth of all of the activities that are happening. I will say that this meeting last year was instrumental in me coming up to speed on healthy waters in New York. I've had the privilege of living 23 years of my academic career in rural America, but that has ranged from lack of water resources like in Montana and northern Utah to being on Lake Michigan for the last 12 years in Chicago. And I grew up in Alaska, where healthy waters and protecting the natural resources was really important. And so I needed to educate myself about healthy waters in this region, and also, I would say, what is a real commitment to the partnership with industry, and how do we support industry as it supports our economy and our growth as a society while paying attention to how we can preserve our resources as industry grows. And so I thank this center for being here and helping in my own education of all of this. Stefan Grimberg is our co-director from Clarkson. So Stefan, thank you for thinking to bring me into knowing about this annual conference and also meeting the people that are here. So it's just wonderful to be here. We want to thank our legislators and NYSTAR for supporting the Centers of Excellence. Really, when I think about Centers of Excellence, I think about how those funds fuel the research that we do, fuel the education that we provide, but importantly, fuel these kinds of gatherings, because we really leapfrog our thinking in both discovery and solutions when we're able to sit around the table and hear from others who think differently than we do. And so that's a big priority for remembering that we come, we drink coffee, we have great meals, we socialize, but what we really do is open up our minds to hearing different perspectives, different progress, and that really is what pushes frontier discovery and transformational solutions forward. So thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you for allowing me to welcome you, and I look forward to seeing you throughout the day and tonight.
So we're going to spend a couple minutes before the keynote talking about our center a little bit. For those of you who you don't know, so there's 17 Center of Excellences in New York State. They're funded through the legislator. They're administered through NYSTAR, and I think we're grateful for that support we're receiving. So we're very dependent on a budget process, so we're still waiting for the budget for this year. But we're hopeful that it will come through for the next year's budget. That's how we get funded. What are we doing? So we are really, our center is one of the public-private partnerships. So we are one of 2 universities in the center system where we have a public-private partnership between ESF and Clarkson, working together with to ultimately foster interactions to industry. And to translate our research or to help industry ultimately make progress in their economic development. So we've received some money, $3.6 million since our existence, and we turned that into about $8 million in federal and industry support. So I think this is a good investment from the state to ultimately spur economic development. What do? We ultimately support external partners in their discovery and ultimately to promote their research and their technologies. So we're trying to bring together, and our funds help incentivize that facilitation, those partnerships. And then also, because we're universities, we obviously train the next scientists in New York in terms of workforce development, which is an important component, obviously, in that field. Some of our partners at this point listed on the list there, we are working with large companies, small companies, startup companies, and non-for-profits in between. And so we're trying to work with every stakeholders who are touching water. And so I think this is a small list, and hopefully that list is growing over the years. as we build our recognition in terms of our center, and hopefully people are recognize the value of these partnerships. Just one more slide in terms of impact. So this is more updated over since the last year, pretty much the economic work. So we are pretty much, we have to report because it's an NISTAR program. We ask our collaborators of economic impact what our funding does to them. And so they externally report economic impact. And so last year we reported $3 million of an economic impact for an investment of $1 million. So again, 3-to-1 return, which is not as good as some of the other centers. So we still have work to do to make this even better. But I think we are going in the right direction. What we do really well, I think we engage a lot of different people. So we have engaged over the time a lot of different faculty members, a lot of stakeholders, and I think that is parts where we are really thriving. I think we are really trying to embrace a lot of different people. We give out seed grants, larger grants, and education grants, and so this is one way for us to stimulate our interactions with corporations, and ultimately some more. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
So just a little bit more in terms of working with the COE. So just so people sort of understand the structure of the COE is money flows to Clarkson and ESF, and then it's sort of our job to find partnerships on projects. So we have sort of different types of projects. Some are research seed projects, so smaller things that we're trying to grow and get bigger. Larger projects we refer to as commercialization and implementation projects, which are farther along sort of in their development, and then education and outreach, and then larger grant preparation. So if you're interested in teaming with faculty or staff from ESF or Clarkson, please talk to us. That's a big point of this meeting. And tomorrow we'll have a session in the morning at 9 o'clock from Courtney Johnson-Woods from the COE to talk a little bit about forging those partnerships. This was from what people put on the form when they submitted to come to the conference, the number of the topics people are interested in. I think this really reflects the range of topics that the COE can cover, really anything having to do with water quality, water science and technology, management, and really implementation of those things. I think that's one thing that sort of sets the COE apart from sort of other entities is sort of this goal to both bridge science, technology, and actual implementation in terms of management. And that's really, as we get to what is the goal of this meeting, it is to share information, but it is to also engage in conversation, build new relationships, and really bridge this difficult divide often of taking science knowledge and using it in an impactful way. So really, if you're doing, the point of today is not just listen, but ask questions. Hopefully everyone can walk away from the meeting knowing one or two people they didn't know before. So especially students that are here, make that a goal for yourself. Okay, so who is here? So we have a mix of about 50% academic, but then about 50% of nonprofit, government, industry, engineering. So it's sort of a different crowd maybe than a typical conference, so please take advantage of that. Okay, our schedule for the day, we might already be a little behind, but we'll have a keynote in just a minute. And then we have first breakout session at 10 a.m., followed by lunch starting at 11:30 back here. I'll mention, I'll show a map after the keynote, but the breakout sessions are in Baker Lab. So basically, just if you're not familiar with campus, if you go out the south side of this building and then turn right, and probably the easiest thing is to head down the stairs outside, and that's where Baker Lab is. I'll repeat that again later, but just so people sort of get the sense of where they're headed for those sessions. All the breakout sessions are in the same building, in rooms right next to each other, so it should be easy to find. Okay. So on to sort of one of our main parts of the morning is our keynote address. I'm very happy to introduce Charlie Driscoll. I've actually been trying to get Charlie to do this for 3 years now. I think he was in New Hampshire one year, and then in China, and then he finally was here. So Charlie is a faculty member at Syracuse University in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He really is one of the foremost experts on biogeochemistry, environmental chemistry involving atmospheric deposition, so topics like acid rain, mercury deposition, and nitrogen deposition. Charlie and his collaborators have written really hundreds of papers on these topics. He's dealt with this over decades, both in the scientific scientific realm and then the policy realm. So we're really lucky to have Charlie share with us today his work specifically on the Adirondacks. So I'm not going to say much more than that. Charlie really can speak for himself, so I'll invite Charlie to come on up. Thanks, Charlie.
Oh, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Anyway, it's good to see this wonderful crowd. And I have to tell you, I was feeling pretty guilty about, Steve has asked me, as he said, and I was going to bring it up. And since he brought it up already, I'll say that I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry it's taken so much time. But and also a little surprise from Joni. I've known Joni for a long time, and I had no idea she was related to Jim Mahoney, who I knew back in the day and worked with. So anyway, this is a good setup to the talk. So in the session tomorrow, Kevin Rose, my colleague from RPI, that's going to be one of the workshop topics. And so this is sort of a little primer on the Adirondacks. So I've had a lot of help in this talk. I've stole slides from all sorts of people. So the backstory on this is that when I first started doing research at Cornell and then later at Syracuse University, when I was hired as an assistant professor many, many, many years ago, the problem that I was working on was acidification of lakes in the Adirondacks. So we'll tell you a story about the nature of that acidification, even though it's old history, and then what has been happening in the intervening years, talking about the Clean Air Act and the impacts of that, and then where we are today and where we might go in the future in terms of this scale project that Joni mentioned. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I've actually told you my outline here, so I'm going to skip over that slide in the interest of time. So hopefully all of you have been to the Adirondacks. It is an amazing place. We're so fortunate to have this in our backyard. It was established in the 1890s by New York State to try to protect waters because of impacts that are going on within the Adirondack region. It's the largest park in the lower 48 states. It's larger than, as I say here, Yosemite, Yellowstone Glacier, Grand Canyon, and the Great Smoky Mountain National Park combined. It is a massive resource for the region. So getting started on this, I was hired by Syracuse University in 1979, a long time ago. Immediately, I was welcomed by colleagues at ESF and Clarkson. I've done a lot of work over the years with folks at both institutions. And one of my initial focuses was on looking at the impacts of acid rain. So this is a map, the earliest map from the National Atmospheric Deposition Program of sulfate deposition back in the 80s, and you can see the red in much of the eastern U.S., and that was the impacts of sulfate, which is a major component of atmospheric deposition back then. So there was some interest, we're talking about the Reagan administration, there was some interest in this, not really doing anything about it, but really studying it. There was actually quite a bit of research that was done through the 80s, and there was a survey done by the EPA on acid-sensitive areas, including the Adirondacks, and the state and researchers from New York State were outraged by how few lakes were identified by the EPA at that time. And so there was an effort going forward, the Adirondack Lake Survey Corporation, or Adirondack Survey, which was a massive effort in the mid-'80s to really try to characterize the impacts of acid rain in the Adirondack region. So these are the objectives here: determine the number of lakes that are impacted, to try to classify those lakes, try to identify those attributes that linked acid deposition with their sensitivity and the status of fish communities, and then looking at recovery, how these systems might recover. So we can talk a little bit about that. This is a slide that I stole from John Borelli, who's over here. I stole a bunch of slides from him. It's a nice slide. It shows the number of lakes. I mean, this is only about, well, we could argue about what is a lake, but this is only approximately about half the lakes. But it was really a massive undertaking, probably unprecedented. And the size of the circle, each circle represents a lake that was surveyed, and the size of the circle represents the pH value. And you can see many of those lakes have had low pH back in the times. In fact, this is a summary of some of the data, and you can see about a quarter of the lakes had pH values that were below 5, and we'll talk a little bit about acid neutralizing capacity, or ANC, or alkalinity, but again, about a quarter of those were considered to be highly acidic water. So this was a much greater estimate in terms of numbers of waters, but these are relatively small lakes, high elevation systems for the most part, and relatively sensitive. So this is a map showing you where those acid-impacted lakes were, largely in the western Adirondacks and the Oswegatchie Black drainage area. And this is a slide showing you from the survey the lakes with fish and the fishless lakes. So that survey was an amazing resource, and we're still utilizing it today, and we'll talk later in the talk and tomorrow about the plans for a resurvey, slightly orienting towards different questions that are more relevant today. So we were able to evaluate relationships between water quality and fisheries. This shows the number of fish for each of the lakes by values of acid neutralizing capacity, and acid neutralizing capacity is a measure of the sensitivity of waters. Lower values of acid neutralizing capacity, or negative values, are acidic water. So you can see that, at higher values of acid neutralizing capacity, there were relatively diverse communities of fish, and then as the acid neutralizing capacity decreased, we had a number of fishless lakes. The other topic that I want to talk to you about, this is kind of a provincial talk. I'm talking about things that I have studied and that I love. But this is also a component of atmospheric deposition and mercury. People, in the time of the original lake survey, they didn't really understand the link between air pollution and mercury. But in the intervening years, they found out that much of the same source of air pollution that caused acid rain also caused elevated mercury deposition. So this is a cartoon showing a little bit about the mercury cycle, which I could give a keynote talk exclusively on that, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about mercury. So there are mercury emissions. Back in the day, they were largely from coal-fired power plants and from incinerators. Now it's small-scale gold mining. Mercury can be transported very long distances or short distances, depending on the form of mercury that's released. But it reaches the land surface. It then can be converted back to elemental mercury and evaded back to the atmosphere. But some of it will run off and get into lakes and streams. And in environments like lakes or wetlands, there are bacterial communities that will convert the inorganic mercury to something known as methylmercury. And methylmercury bioaccumulates and is biomagnified up the aquatic food chain. So from water to algae, the methylmercury will bioaccumulate by a factor of 10,000, and then insects, even more so, 100,000, small fish, 1 million, up to 10 million. And so if you're at the top of the food chain, you could be exposed to very, very high concentrations of mercury. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And the Adirondacks we found from these early studies, is highly sensitive to mercury, more sensitive for a given level of mercury input than most areas around the world. And it's because of the attributes. And this sounds counterintuitive, but it's largely a remote area. We think about it as unimpacted, but it has abundance of trees, and foliage is very effective at scavenging that mercury out of the atmosphere, an abundance of lakes and wetlands environments to convert inorganic mercury to methylmercury. It's also very unproductive, so not a lot of fish productivity, but those fish that are there accumulate high levels of mercury. And also impacts of acid rain. Low acidity accentuates mercury contamination. So we did some early studies to try to look at relationships between water quality and fish mercury. These were some data from the Adirondack Lake Survey Corporation in the late 2000s. Only a few lakes, and this is for yellow perch. And we saw that some factors of these lakes would be strongly influencing fish mercury, dissolved organic carbon, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the talk, but particularly pH. Low pH conditions drove high fish mercury concentrations. Okay, so we've got a twist, we've got a switch. We have the Clean Air Act, thanks to Jim and others who worked very hard on this. So this is a slide showing you national emissions of sulfur dioxide in red, nitrogen oxides in blue, and ammonia. I'm not going to talk a lot about ammonia, but I'm quite interested in that. I could have done a keynote on that, but we'll save that for another day. So you can see that really from the start of these emission inventories in the 1970s, sulfur dioxide has dropped and looks like it may be leveling off today. The levels are very, very low that we think are close to natural conditions. It's a remarkable success story. The pattern for nitrogen oxides is a little bit different, relatively flat until about the 2000s, and really from the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, large drops to control nitrogen oxide emissions. Less so for ammonia, that's largely from agricultural sources. So the source are really fossil fuel combustion for sulfur dioxide, coal emissions, and for nitrogen oxides, transportation sources, and also electric utilities. Okay, so these are some maps showing you the Adirondack region, showing you contrasting first sulfate deposition in the upper panel from the early 2000s to the most recent values today. The red color represents high deposition. So you can see back in the day, the southwestern Adirondacks was impacted, the High Peaks area was impacted. Where the acid-sensitive lakes are, they receive the highest levels of atmospheric sulfate deposition. And today, nada, very, very low inputs. Really a remarkable success over relatively short periods of time. Similar pattern for nitrate. So these include not only wet deposition and precipitation, but these are model estimates to look at gaseous and particulate forms of these contaminants. And then finally, a pattern for ammonia, similar pattern. So I mentioned one of the objectives of the original Adirondack survey was to try to classify lake sensitivity, different types of lakes. And indeed, that's what we did. And I think that classification system, although it was done a long, long time ago, I think is a relevant framework thinking about how lakes are function going forward today. So we divided broadly the lakes, remember it's about 1,500 lakes, into two broad classes, drainage lakes and seepage lakes. So what are drainage lakes? Drainage lakes are lakes where water drains through the watershed, through the lake, through an outlet of the lake, and then downstream. Seepage lakes are really holes in the landscape, no distinct outflow of the lake. So seepage lakes could be groundwater fed, moving through the groundwater into those systems, or they could be perched, kettle lakes, which are very common in the Adirondacks, which the lake level is above the surrounding ground level. And those types of lakes in particular are highly sensitive. For the drainage lakes, the deposits of glacial till critically sensitive to the sensitivity of a particular watershed. So if a watershed in a lake has deposits of thin deposits of glacial till, relatively shallow flow paths, high sensitivity to atmospheric inputs of acids. If you have thick deposits of glacial till, that could neutralize the acidity, and the groundwater coming in would produce waters with relatively neutral pH. So different characteristics, landscape characteristics, influence the sensitivity of Adirondack lakes. Okay, so I'm going to talk, I said a little bit about this term, alkalinity or acid neutralizing capacity. This was the focus of my dissertation many, many years ago. So there are basically two ways to look at acid neutralizing capacity or alkalinity. You can measure it in the lab. You do a titration with a strong acid, or you can calculate it and look at the theoretical value. So acid neutralizing capacity is a measure of the acid-base status. It's the quantity of bases that are supplied to water, like calcium and magnesium, versus the acids which supply acidity, like sulfuric acid and nitric acid. So you can calculate the theoretical value, and you can compare that to the measured value, and I'll show you some of that today. Also, an outgrowth of that Adirondack Lake Survey was an establishment of a long-term monitoring program to monitor the chemistry of a subset of lakes, a relatively small subset of lakes over time. And that was the Adirondack Long-Term Monitoring Program. And we broke those lakes down for selection based on this acid sensitivity class. So we have some seepage lakes, we have some drainage lakes, we have thin till lakes, we have thick till lakes. And I'll show you some of those. So that monitoring program, funded by a variety of groups over time, has gone on. It actually continues at a diminished level today. We collected samples monthly. So we started in the 80s with 17 lakes, and then the early 90s, the DEC took it over and expanded it to about 50 lakes. This is one of the original lakes. I love this lake, Big Moose Lake in the Western Adirondack. I had to put a photo in here of it. And this shows the time series of a number of attributes. Now, one of the reasons why I love this problem is it's very complex. It involves a lot of interactions, a lot of things. So I have all the chemical constituents that make up acid neutralizing capacity: sulfate from acid rain, nitrate, acid neutralizing capacity, pH, aluminum. I haven't talked about aluminum, but aluminum is a dominant metal in soil, and it gets mobilized under low pH conditions. It can be bound up with organic matter, and that's benign, but it can also be mobilized in an inorganic form, and that's toxic to trees and fish. And that's a driver of loss of fish, we found, for the Adirondacks. And then the last, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is dissolved organic carbon. Organic carbon, which we saw is increasing mobilized. So this is the evolution of waters for the Adirondacks over time from an acid-impacted lake. So I said we had about 50 lakes. This shows you the trends in those lakes over time. So they're all decreasing in sulfate from decreases in acid rain. Virtually all are decreasing in nitrate. They're all decreasing in these base cations that neutralize the acidity because the acids mobilize that from soil. The acid neutralizing capacity, either the measured or the calculated values, are increasing. That's good news. The hydrogen ion is going down, and the aluminum is going down in a large number of lakes. So there's a lot of evidence, overwhelming evidence of recovery, but it's highly variable across these systems. As I said, I'm going to focus on dissolved organic carbon. This is a cumulative frequency diagram showing you the rate of change of dissolved organic carbon, and we see that many of the lakes are having more and more organic matter in their water. Not all of them, but most of them, and most of them are significant if it's a dark blue color here. The other thing is the range of values. There's a huge range of variability in the mobilization of carbon. So this is a phenomena that's known as browning. And browning is something that's going on in the Adirondacks. I have a photo here from my colleague, Kurt Stegler, who shows a photo of a lake in the 1980s, and when you go up and sample in the 1980s, I mean, these lakes were unbelievably blue. I mean, you could just see down to the bottom, unbelievable. And today, they're all brown. They all look like tea. So it's really a remarkable transformation. So why are we interested in this? Well, it's an interesting phenomenon, and we know some about it. We know that it attenuates light, and so therefore it will change this thermal stratification regime of lakes. When we alter this thermal stratification regime, they're getting warmer, and they're warmer for a longer period. That will contribute, because of the strengthening of the stratification, that contributes to the depletion of oxygen in the hypolimnion. It changes the carbon balance of these lakes. There can be nutrients or toxicants associated with them, like mercury. It influences the production of photochemical oxidants, and it increases the cost of water treatment. So there's a whole host of effects of browning. So we see, this shows, it's a fairly complicated slide. I told you I like complexity. So these are these lake classes and how they're varying with DOC, the color. The color is really the measure of the browning. And so you can see that they are getting higher dissolved organic carbon, but they're also getting colored. But the rate of coloring is greater than the rate of browning, particularly in many of the seepage lakes and the thin till lakes, which are the most sensitive lakes to impacts of acid rain. We've also looked at how do these lakes recover as we reduce their sulfate and nitrate from acid rain. So these, again, are the symbols of the different classes of lakes, and they're all decreasing in sulfate nitrate. So these are all the lakes that have shown statistically significant patterns, and we can see there's a lot of variability. They are all increase in acid neutralizing capacity, but the degree to which they're recovering is highly variable across these systems. So the seepage lakes are recovering relatively fast, and the thin till drainage lakes are recovering less fast. And the lower panel here shows the base cations that are neutralizing that acid rain. So as the acid rain decreases and the sulfate and nitrate decreases, the mobilization of base cations is also decreasing. So that will also generate acid neutralizing capacity. So I wanted to look at what's the difference between the theory and the measured values. How do the calculated values, the theory, vary with the measured value? And that's what this one-to-one line is. And the lakes in the Adirondacks, they're not really following the theory very well. They're recovering at a much lower rate than we would expect based on the measured values of the sulfate and nitrate and cations, and particularly these acid-sensitive systems, particularly the thin till drainage lakes. A big driver of that is the organic carbon. So what we think is happening is as the lakes recover, they are allowing for the mobility of the organic acids, naturally occurring organic acids from soils as these soils recover, and they're mobilizing carbon, and the lakes are getting browner. So that is delaying the recovery to some extent. So, Steve, you should give me a time if I'm getting close. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a snippet about mercury because I'm very passionate about it. Mercury is an incredibly complicated subject. I mentioned it's an air pollutant. Most lakes, most waters, most fish get their mercury from air pollution, overwhelmingly from. We have cases like Onondaga Lake. Jody and I have gone back and forth for decades on Onondaga Lake. And so that's an industrial source. That is the exception, not the rule. But the Adirondacks, it's mostly air pollution. This is a slide showing you the emission inventories from the 90s up to close to present from different sources of mercury. So back before the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, there was huge inputs of mercury from the electric utilities and incinerators, medical waste and municipal waste incinerators. The incinerators got their act together almost immediately following the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. Those were dropped, but I always have these fights with electric utilities. It just takes a long time. And over time, through a number of iterations with different administrations and EPAs, we have slowly brought down. So what we see here today is approximately an 85% decrease in mercury emissions. So it's really gone down, and we see this. There is a monitoring site that ESF runs at Huntington Forest. We've been measuring mercury there for decades, and we're seeing decreases in mercury deposition. It's an amazing success story. So these are some model calculations that we've done. On the far, your right-hand side, these are estimates of total deposition comparing 1990 to recent values from 2020, and the red color shows mercury deposition inputs. And so you can see the east, like with acid rain back in the day, high inputs. The far left, closest to me, shows if we turn off the U.S. emissions only, and you can see it's all blue, much, much lower. So our U.S. contributions have greatly reduced mercury deposition. The one in the middle are all other sources, global sources. So now global sources represent the dominant input of mercury to the U.S. and globally. And this is mostly from artisanal gold mining. Okay, so we're also measuring fish. And the story is not very good, I hate to tell you, for mercury in fish. So we're very fortunate. Cornell has had archive samples of mercury starting from the mid-early 2000s for a number of lakes. So these are for brook trout. There are about 10 samples of individual fish. These are length-adjusted values. Just for your guidance, typically a 0.3 part per million is thought to be ones where there would be concerns of consumption. But there are no statistically significant trends. East Lake is probably close to being statistically significant, but we don't see those trends. But where there may be factors that are contributing to this. So my friend and colleague, John Borelli, has been modeling from those original Adirondack surveys what we would expect for summer temperatures, and the projections are that they are increasing. The upper water temperatures are projected to increase. And then also changes in the stratification. So it was established a relationship between water clarity and epidemic temperature. So an important part of that driver is not only increases in temperature, but the browning, which absorbs light and increases the attenuation of light in the upper waters. So another colleague at the time at Cornell, Steve Jane, and colleagues have gone in and put sondes in lakes to try to look at these dynamics. How are these lakes changing? And these are 3 lakes showing 3 different patterns of summer conditions that could impact cold water fisheries. So let me orient you to this. So the x-axis is time, June, July, August, September, October, and then the y-axis is lake depth. So the top of the page is the surface of the lake down to the deepest area of the lake. So you can see up above, you can see the yellow and brown. Those represent conditions that are stressful to fish because of warm temperatures, because of warm conditions. The cold water fish cannot tolerate high temperatures. The brown in the lower part represents the depletion of oxygen. The blue area is the area of the lake that is unimpactful, suitable habitat for fish. So Steve Jane and colleagues divided up the lakes into classes. Constrained lakes, where there's warming of the upper waters and oxygen depletion, but there's a little bit of space that they can reside at. Squeeze lakes, where the temperature increases meet up with the oxygen, and there's not really much space for these. And then overheated lakes, these are relatively shallow lakes, and they basically heat from top to bottom. So what they did is they studied these 15 lakes, and they put them into these classes: squeezed, overheated, constrained, and also what they call buffered. And those are lakes that have suitable habitat, and they're not a problem. And they compared this with the original Adirondack Lake survey lakes, and that's shown in these bar diagrams. So you can see, based on these projections, that many of these cold water fisheries could be challenged by different conditions. So that's one of the things we want to look at in this scale survey. The other thing, I have to bring in mercury here. How does this influence the mercury? So we measured the mercury in brook trout for each of these lakes. And it's hard to see here, but along the bottom, you see the green. Those are buffered lakes. Those are ones that have a suitable habitat. Red, those are 3 lakes that exhibit overheating. Black, those are lakes that are constrained. And the orange are those squeeze lakes. And what you see is the buffered lakes and the overheated lakes. Those fish have relatively low fish mercury. There are 2 years for this, 21 and 22. But then if you get to the constrained lakes, some of them are okay, but some of them are experiencing high fish mercury. And then these squeeze lakes, they have problems. You know, they're getting a lot of mercury because their food is right at the limits where the oxygen is low. So they go into these low oxygen waters to get food, and they're loaded with methyl mercury. And so I told you that low pH was a problem, and we see that continuing today. This is pH as a function of fish mercury, and we see as the pH is lower, the higher the fish mercury. But if the lake has hypolimitic oxygen depletion, the problem is greatly exacerbated. So climate and effects of climate change and browning are clearly interacting with these other things, which leads me to the end of the talk. Hopefully I've got a few more minutes. And there are now we're today and we're looking forward. So there are these recovery from acid rain. Mercury is probably still with us because of legacy effects, but there are a whole host of other stressors, including climate change. And so they include various implications of climate change, not only warming, but loss of ice, loss of snowpack, dissolved oxygen loss, changes in precipitation, and other stressors. I mentioned mercury, browning, but there's land cover, invasive species, harmful algal blooms, a whole host of things to look at. So we know that precipitation is increasing, and the projections suggest that it's going to increase. We also know that there are fewer rainfall events, but the events that are there are more intense. We're seeing that in the measured data. We see extreme storms, which you've seen in Newcomb a couple years ago that wiped out a lot of the facilities there at ESF. We're seeing changes particularly in winter conditions. The warming is occurring to the greatest degree in winter. So we see changes in the ice cover period of lakes. It's getting shorter and shorter, not only in the Adirondacks, but across the U.S., as shown from EPA data. We're seeing more and more harmful algal blooms. I study harmful algal blooms in Skinny Atlas Lake. I never thought we would ever see them in Adirondack lakes, but we're seeing harmful algal blooms in these very, very unproductive Adirondack lakes. What's driving that? Well, probably temperature change, but maybe some of these other factors are coming into play. We're seeing increases in salinity from maybe road salt and other factors. And we mentioned browning. So this is, again, some of John's good work where he tries to project, based on the original Adirondack Lake Survey, how lakes might change in terms of their browning and stratification. So that leads us to scale. We have these projections. We have this great database from the 80s, but what's going on today? We know that there are a lot of changes. And so there's a plan today through scale, survey of climate and Adirondack Lake ecosystems. So a number of lakes, as was mentioned, are planning for starting immediately. We've done pilot studies, and we will have 3 classes of lakes: high-intensity lakes that will be sampled not once, but monthly through the stratification season from May to October. Those will have sondes placed in them. There will be measurements of water quality and fisheries, climatic values. Their second class will be ones of moderate intensity, so single lakes that will be sampled through the monthly intervals, and those also will have sondes in them, but they will only be sampled once. There will be 30 of those. And then the low intensity lakes, which are the remainder, about 250 so lakes, which will be sampled once over the course of the study. So we're going to take advantage of those sondes that I talked to you from the Steam Jane study, where there will be sensors that will be deployed to measure water quality data over time. These sites will also have weather stations and trail cameras, and the data will be retrieved. They will also have sampling for a number of attributes shown here, which I don't have time to elaborate, but a number of chemical attributes, biological measurements, and a whole host of field measurements that will be collected at the sites. And so I mentioned that we've had these pilot studies that have gone on that set the stage for this design, and we're working very hard to get the field operations underway, and we're going to be starting sampling very, very soon for a couple of years. And then once we collect the data, there will be a large database available for a whole community of people, hopefully, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow, what will be available. So if you have a problem of interest in Adirondack Lake, some data, I mean, there'll be a massive database, and it will take a community to really look it over and evaluate it going forward. So let me conclude, and then if there's any time, I'm happy to take any questions. So, I mean, I've lived through this, so it's really been remarkable for me, but the Adirondacks have really had this remarkable experiment, so to speak, where we've seen the impacts of acid rain and mercury, and now we're documenting the recovery. We've seen recovery from acid rain. It may be not what we expected because of the impacts of browning. We're not really seeing chemical recovery from mercury, and that may be due to the browning effects. It could also be due to legacy effects from accumulation of mercury in soils. There's a lot of variability, though, given that broad statement. Some lakes have recovered very effectively, some have been delayed. A lot of the delay is due to watershed attributes, hydrologic flow paths, in particular browning. We see it appears that fish mercury recovery has been retarded, probably in part due to this enhanced stratification, which provides a lengthening of environment that is conducive for methylmercury formation. And then finally, we're hopeful that scale will be very effective at helping to answer these questions, dealing with recovery of acid rain and mercury, but also new questions concerning climate impacts, harmful algal blooms, salinity, a whole host of issues invasive that the Adirondacks are experiencing. So I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. You're going to let me off the hook? Okay. I should have expected it.
So you talked about the browning, increase in browning, which is very dramatic. It seems like there's a whole host of variables, right? There's the leaching from the soils, there's more productivity, there's higher temperatures. Can you point to, do we know yet what's the big driver, or is it just still, are we still exploring?
Well, there's quite a bit known about browning. Browning is a phenomena, in the Adirondacks, but also in Canada, in New England. Basically, any place that was impacted by acid rain is experiencing browning. There's a huge effort going on in Europe, in the UK, in Scandinavia. And generally, there are a variety of hypotheses. I think the one that's to the fore is reduce leaching of acidity and higher pH, because dissolved organic matter is more soluble at higher pH. Also, I mentioned briefly aluminum. Aluminum, if you're familiar with water treatment, that's a coagulant that's applied to remove dissolved organic matter, and phosphorus, I should add. And the aluminum concentrations, particularly the inorganic aluminum, is way down. Virtually non-detectable. And so I think that is the primary, but climate, more mineralization of organic matter. There are changes in tree species. We haven't talked at all about watershed effects, but we're seeing huge changes in tree species and mycorrhizal activities going on within watersheds, and land cover changes. So there's a host of factors. And like you say, we particularly see prominent browning, but we probably haven't measured the greening, but we see indicators of this with harmful algal blooms, but there could be changes in chlorophyll as well. So, we're hopeful that with scale and the more detailed measurements and the technologies that are available in scale, we'll be able to sort this out and characterize and quantify. Part of the work will be fairly detailed characterization of the components of dissolved organic matter, elements of chlorophyll, specific pigments, things like that. So we're going to do a lot more characterization of the how these organic matters are changing and what their influences on lake structure and function. Greg?
To follow up on that, do you know what the original browning level of the lakes were? So by the time we started studying in the 1980s, acid rain is already, so if we had gone back to the 1800s or the 1700s, were these lakes brown or blue?
Yeah, that was a point of contention back in the day. So there was two folks, Krug and Frink, who said acid rain isn't a problem. These lakes were historically acidic. The characterization of the acidity was different. It was organic acidity back in the day, and now it's inorganic acidity, and we shouldn't be worried about that. They had an article in Science, very provocative, and at the time, And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There was a paleo study done by folks in Canada where they tried to reconstruct the dissolved organic carbon history in the experimental lakes area, which is an area not in sort of northwestern Ontario, not really impacted severely by acid rain with the Adirondacks. And they could see back in the day, both sites had higher concentrations of DOC, and then this period of reduction, and then this period of increase, but it was more pronounced in the Adirondacks. So I think there is a lot of truth to that they were probably naturally brown and probably influenced with this decrease from coagulation with aluminum, and now they're coming back. Whether it's the same way, I think we don't have really any good historical measurements, but just really sort of anecdotal information. But that's a good question. Yes?
Is there any thinking of looking at the effects of forever chemicals that might be entering those systems in the Adirondack?
I think that's part of the situation. I mean, we have quite a bit of money to do this, but we're also looking for additional resources. So I think we are thinking about this, and we're going to talk tomorrow about what is the full nature. I can only give it a short, but I think those are on the table, these very resistant chemicals. I think that's a component that we've been thinking about. But we also would like the community to be aware of the study, and if you have ideas for a study or entering databases or doing follow-up studies on these characterized lakes, it's a great opportunity because we'll have all this base material, but we're hoping a lot of people will be interested in focused questions that we can really broaden the understanding of the Adirondacks. So this is a great opportunity for us in scale to try to reach out to the community, let the community know what we're thinking, what the original design is, and a call for people to collaborate with us. Yes?
Related to the previous question, are you interested in tracking the use of, say, de-icing instruments or boat weight? Those are increasing the resuspension of sediment, which is pertinent to the mercury and the VOC.
Yeah, I think we're interested in a whole host of issues. We're concerned about de-icing and impacting those types of things. So yeah, that's on the table for questions, and we would like people to be thinking about that. And there should be nice databases to try to address these questions. So what do you think, Steve? Should we cut it off? All right, one more question. I saw somebody back. Oh yeah, way in the back.
I'm curious about the rollback on federal environmental regulations and the emphasis on coal and what you anticipate that.
Well, I can tell you what I think, but I have no influence from the EPA. I've had a love-hate relationship with the EPA over my entire career, and I certainly don't speak for them. I've been thrown off EPA committees, but I'll tell you what I think. Electric utilities, even though I complain about them, I have a tremendous respect for electric utilities. I mean, what they do is just simply remarkable. But they've relied on coal. Coal is a bad thing. I mean, there have been so many health problems. I mean, we're talking about water quality here, and obviously that's important, but air quality is equally important. And they've invested greatly in air quality control. And in Trump 1, there was an effort to roll back the mercury and air toxics standards. I collaborated with the electric utilities because they were suing the Trump administration because they had invested so much money into this air quality control, and now they were talking about rolling back these rules. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to go back to coal. First of all, it's very expensive, the air quality, and the next administration, and people care about air quality. It is a big issue in red and blue states. So even though I'm upset about the proposals, I don't think they're going to hopefully result in, I mean, we have air issues, no doubt about it. But I'm hoping that we're not going to go back to the bad old days and have, uncontrolled burning of coal. That would be insane, even though there's a lot of strange things going on these days. Anyway, I think that's a good one to end on. What do you think? I could get in trouble very easily here. I got to be good with Jody here. I try to keep on her good side. So. Good?